Hi, I'm Gareth Green and welcome to another video in our series where we're trying to get inside the mind of Bach. Fairly mind-blowing concept, but always a fascinating journey. And we're looking at chorales, or just a few phrases of chorales, to see what we can learn about the Bach style. And today we're looking at a chorale that's number 348 in the Riemann-Schneider collection, but you don't need to worry about that. The score is on the screen. And we're particularly thinking about this idea, using scalic bass lines. It's something that Bach loves to do in his music and in the chorales in particular, but it's also a useful thing to think about if you're a composer, just to think about the impact of doing this. But before we get into the detail, let's have a listen to these first two phrases of this particular chorale, Meinen Jesu. Okay, well, let's just start by unpacking the harmony a bit so we can see what's going on, and then we can see how these scalic bass lines are used as part of the harmonic structure. Well, clearly this is a chorale that starts in the key of C major. The very first chord is the tonic chord of C major, so nothing too complicated about that. Then we have a B flat introduced, which is quite interesting. We'll come back to that, but we're going on to another chord of C major before we go to a chord of F major. So even though this starts on a chord of C major, the tonic chord, that B flat comes in straight away and flags up F major. So it's kind of going from C major to F major is going from chord 1 to chord 4 in C major, but there's also that sense, because of the B flat, that it's going from chord 5 to chord 1 in F major. So it's a lovely way in which Bach sort of builds in this secondary dominant, a sort of temporary 5-1 in another key, where the 1 is a chord in the prevailing key, so 1 in F major, but it's also 4 in C major. So it kind of starts in C major. The first phrase is solidly in C major, but we just have that little harmonic ambiguity or added rich touch with the B flat, suggesting the F major chord. Then at the end of the first bar, that's a chord 2. Then at the beginning of the second bar, there's a 5-7 chord, dominant 7th with a passing note, 5-1. Slightly unusual, I might say, in the Bach style. Quite often Bach will have chord 5 and then he'll make it richer by adding the 7th. So you go 5, 5, 7 and then move on to 1 or 6 normally. In this case, slightly unusually, at the beginning of this second bar where you've got this chord, you see there's a dominant 7th chord with a passing note to a straight 5 and then 1. So having had that kind of slightly rich start with the suggestion of F major, we then have a very simple 5-1 cadence in C major. Okay, the second phrase modulates to G major. Well, that's not too surprising. G major is the dominant key, isn't it? So bar 3 starts with a G major chord in its first inversion. Well, that's a nice pivot chord, because it's chord 5 in the original key, C major, and it's chord 1 in the new key. So we've got this in the new key, chord 1, first inversion, and then there's a sort of passing note there. Some interesting stuff here, because you think, really? The second beat of this bar, this chord here, looks like 1 in second inversion. Now we have to be a little bit careful about how we use second inversions, but slightly unusual to go from a first inversion to a second inversion, particularly if it doesn't kind of resolve by 6-4 progressing to 5-3, which this doesn't. But if we see the harmony as this, it makes more sense. So the D, this note here, we regard as an accented passing note, accented passing tone, if you know them as that, and we see this note as the harmony note. well, then what we've got is an E minor 7 chord. So that's a 6-7. Kind of makes more sense. So 1 in first inversion, 6-7, and then we get 2-7, and then he does the same trick again, because if we regard this as an accented passing note, we can see this as the harmony, and that is all giving us a dominant seventh in the key of G. So that makes more sense. But quite interesting how he's elaborated that with those accented passing notes. So we'll come back to those. And then going into bar 4, here's chord 1, passing note, chord 2 in first inversion, bit of decoration, and then a chord 5-7 in the key of G with a passing note, going to 5. Same thing again, 5-7, going to an ordinary 5. The thing that we don't see so often in Bach, but here we are at the end of the first phrase and the end of the second phrase, before we finish on the tonic chord in G major. So it's kind of useful to understand the harmonic framework before we get into this specific aspect. Okay, let's just focus on the bass line for a moment. Can we see at the beginning, we've got this wonderful scale run. He nearly completes an octave, 1 note short of an octave. And having done that, we have the typical hot cross bun cadence. Hot cross buns, dominant, dominant, tonic. And that's a nice balance. We've got a scale running through the first bar, and then we've got disjunct movement to take us to the cadence, which kind of focuses the cadence a bit. And then in the second phrase, starting in bar 3, we've got Scalic movement again. This time only 4 notes in a group, and then used sequentially, 1 note lower. So that's quite effective. You know, it gives a real kind of melodic identity to the bass line. It's not just the bass line being a bass line. The bass line's got lots to say in its own right, but the scale run going up 4 notes, and then again a note lower, and then slowing down in the next bar on the approach to the cadence. And so we always had this contrast between the first bar being scalic and busy, moving along in quavers there, or eighth notes, and then slower moving as we come to the cadence, but without the scale run. So it's quite interesting how he kind of uses scales in particular bars and then contrasts in a bar that follows. But you've got to be very careful how you do this, because lots of people get hold of the idea if they're trying to write a bass line, that might be quite a nice idea to have some scale work going in it. And if they're trying to harmonize in the style of Bach, that this might be a good thing to go for. But of course, you've got to make sure that the whole thing works harmonically. And when you write scales, you're going to end up with a mixture of harmony notes or chord tones, if you know them as that, and inessential notes. So passing notes are bound to be there if you're writing any kind of scale pattern, passing notes or passing tones. So if we look at the beginning, we see that this first note in the bass obviously belongs to the C major chord. Well, the B flat that we've already mentioned looks like a passing note, doesn't it? Actually, it sort of also makes that chord into a dominant seventh in the key of F in its last inversion. And you often find this happening in Bach when you look at something and you can describe it as some kind of inessential note, and at the same time you can say, but it also has a harmonic function. But it's kind of what's happening here, isn't it? But you see that that's how the B flat is justified. Now then, this chord, we've got a choice in the way we look at it. We could say, well, that A sounds like an accented passing note onto the G, which may be the sense in which it's written. Slightly unusual that this then becomes a tonic chord in its second inversion, but maybe Bach just about gets away with that because of the scale work. So if the bass is moving by step in one direction, and particularly if the melody is going by step in the other direction, we can sometimes get away with these second inversions sandwiched in the middle. Handle with care, I would say. That comes with a health warning if you're actually writing harmony, but that's where they become possible. We normally use second inversions in this sort of context when we're writing passing 6/4s, you know, when we're going 1 and then 5 in second inversion, 1 in first inversion, or the other way around. Or when we're going 4, 1 in second inversion, 4 in first inversion, or the other way around. Those are the genuine kind of passing 6/4s. This is a sort of passing 6/4, but it's not in that conventional way. But it works because you've got this scalic movement in the bass, and you've also got stepwise movement in the upper part going in the opposite direction. But there's a second way of looking at this, because what I've just described is that, where we treat this as an accented passing note, and then we treat this as the actual chord, second inversion chord. In a way, that does seem to be the sense of it. We sort of hear the A as an accented passing note, don't we? You could say, well, actually, I'm regarding this as the harmony, in which case it's an A minor 7 chord, isn't it? Which in C major is called 6/7. Well, is that unusual? Not as unusual as you might think. Lots of people tell us that in the Baroque, you might expect to see a 5/7 or a 2/7, but the other sevens don't get used. Not true. Bach uses 4/7 quite a lot, actually, but he's certainly open to other seventh chords as well. So, do we see that second chord as an accented passing note onto a tonic chord that's second inversion? Or do we see it as chord 6/7 in root position and then an unaccented passing note with a G? The point is, you can see it either way or both ways. Going back to a point we were making about the first chord, really, that B flat in the first chord, is it a harmony note creating a 5/7 in F, or is it a passing note? Bach loves to do this, so you can see it in two possible ways. So, intriguing start, but it very clearly illustrates some of the issues that come up when you get some kind of scalic passage in the bass and how you might handle that. Okay, well, let's move on to complete this initial scale thing. When we get to this point, we've got an F major chord. So that's 4 in the key of C, but 1 in the key of F, if we're regarding that as a secondary dominant in the light of the B flat we talked about in the bass. But there's the chord. This is an unaccented passing note in the bass, that E. It also happens to make the F major chord an F major 7 in its last inversion. So again, we can see the same situation through two windows. And I'm sure Bach's intention was that we should see it through both of those windows. And it's one thing that really is part of the genius of Bach. Okay, well, that's the end of the scale run, and we've talked about this cadence much more straightforward. And it's quite nice the way that actually we don't have continuous scale runs in the bass, because that could get a bit tedious. I mean, he could have done in that second bar something like that, couldn't he, to get another scale run in. But that's not too subtle, because we had the scale run in the first bar. Well, now in the second bar, let's do something a bit different. But you might just notice something that comes in, and it's this. In the alto part in that second bar, there's just a hint of something scalic. You see that? And it follows on quite nicely from the bass. The bass in the first bar coming down the scale, and then the alto taking over. Doesn't continue, but you know, Bach can't help being a contrapuntalist. So even when he's writing these block chords, homophonic chords, there's still just that notion, isn't there, of here's an idea in the bass that then sort of gets taken over in the alto, and it pulls it all together. It's very cohesive in the writing, even though it's only 3 notes of a scale run, but it's interesting just to spot that. Okay, well, we come to bar 3. We talked about these groups of 4 notes being used sequentially. And what's the implication for the harmony? Well, let's have a look. We've talked about this G major chord first inversion, so that's definitely an unaccented passing note. Then this again is one of these things where you think, is it G major second inversion, or is it this 6/7 we talked about? Then we've got the chord 2/7 in G, with an unaccented passing note, then probably this has to be seen as an accented passing note onto the 5/7 chord. So again, you can see how we have to end up using passing notes. If we're going to use passing notes as well, always think, well, there are often more unaccented passing notes than accented passing notes, but Bach loves his accented passing notes as well. So, think about, well, can I use a balance between the two? And then notice this, having had these kind of 4-note scalic things in the bass there, do you notice that in the next bar, we go on to the tenor part, and we've got a sort of 3-note descending thing there. And then we've got another 3-note descending thing later on where we have that. So you can sort of see how he's kind of using that same idea that we talked about at the end of the first phrase. So in bar 3, the bass, then the tenor, and then, and you might even go as far as to say, well, yeah, we've also got a rising scale in the alto here. We've even got, a 3-note thing happening at the top there, haven't we? I mean, how far do you want to take this? But it's quite interesting that where the bass line is using this scalic stuff, the other parts are not. And when the bass stops using the scalic treatment, other parts pick up on it. So there's something a little bit conversational going on with this scalic idea within the texture. And that's really the point I want to make, how Bach uses these scalic bass lines, but how that scalic bass line can often interact with the other parts in the texture. So we end up with this, again, another gem of a pair of phrases from a Bach chorale. So, I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you want to get more into the Bach chorale style, have a look at our online course in how to harmonise chorales in the style of Bach. And you can find that at www.mmcourses.co.uk. Lots of other courses there in harmony theory, oral, keyboard harmony, oral dictation, analysis. Enjoy looking around everything we've got to offer there. And while you're there, on the homepage, just have a click on Maestros. This is a wonderful global musical community that we host. Lots of perks involved in being a maestro, which will interest you. But one of the things is that we offer a monthly live stream where we have a couple of sessions where we make some input in the first session on a topic that's often been a topic raised by members of the group, something they want to know about, and we investigate that in some detail, doing the kind of analysis that we've done in this video, but going much further with it, learning something about the style of a particular composer and putting that in context. And then we have another session which is for individual feedback. So composers, people writing harmony exercises, performers, anybody who wants to submit their work, either complete or in progress, can do so. I'll give you personal feedback on it, but we share that in the group so we can all learn from each other. So lots of people are really enjoying the benefits of joining the Maestros group. That might be something of interest to you as well.